Open your Bibles to Genesis 47. I'll be there in a minute. Ancient Egypt's last glorious era was the New Kingdom. Today we can still see the remains of her ornate, imposing temples and secret burial chambers in the valleys of the kings. This was Imperial Egypt, risen to power and glory, her armies expanding, Egyptian dominion and culture to other lands, her coffers expanding with riches acquired through plunder, conquest, slavery, and tribute. It was the age of the popular King Tut, the Rameses kings, and the likes of Nefertiti. But prior to this era, Egypt experienced another time and kind of wealthy grandeur. The splendor of the Old Kingdom, not the New Kingdom, the Old Kingdom, created one of the wonders of the world, the pyramids. Yet it appears that the magnificence of this Old Kingdom, unlike its younger sister, was not a result of foreign conquest or plunder. Where did its splendid wealth come from? What happened? Empires and nations which consume other nations, but unlike Egypt's imperial New Kingdom, the Old Kingdom had no empire. So where did its resources come from to build this extraordinary civilization? They didn't plunder, they didn't conquer, they didn't take the spoils and the wealth of other nations. So how did they afford to do all this? If none of that was taking place in the Old Kingdom. There's plenty of recorded history on the New Kingdom, how plundering and wars and taking on someone else's spoils and wealth through conquering efforts was the norm. And that's how you build up your empire. But not the Old Kingdom. Not the Old Kingdom. So how do they accumulate the kind of wealth they would need to carry on some of the projects? Massive projects. Even more so when you compare them to the New Kingdom. So where did the resources come from to build this extraordinary civilization? That's the question. The answers are recorded in an ignored old Hebrew book, and historians have ignored it. During the reign of King Zoser, Dynasty III's government administration saw an abrupt and drastic change. And I repeat, King Zoser, I believe, was a regional king. It's the king that Joseph was probably closer to any other king or kings during his lifetime in Egypt after he was released from prison. Now, Joseph went through many kings, just not King Zoser. But King Zoser was a regional king which sparked the lower Egypt, which is the northern part of Egypt, building boom of its day. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the future. During the reign of King Zoser, Dynasty III government administration saw an abrupt and drastic change. Almost overnight, it became the wealthiest on earth. And I don't just think it was the lower kingdom, but I also believe it was the upper kingdom, which would be the lower part of Egypt. It's backwards, remember that. they would become the wealthiest on earth, and not by some small amount. From the looks of his pyramid, King Zoser did not expect to have such magnificent wealth. At first, he built only a small monument like a mastaba, an early burial chamber. You would find those like in the Babylonian area in the Mesopotamian valley. Yet suddenly the king not only possessed money and vast land holdings, he also had a unique grip on a population which was in servitude toward him. A situation which provided everything that was necessary to build the fabulous Zoser complex. And next time I'll show you some pictures of it. Consequently, the pyramid building age arose. So how did King Zoser acquire all the riches, power, and revolutionary technology to build expensive and extraordinary monuments? Historians have commented that Egypt before the Third Dynasty was populated by a people who, for the most part, owned their own land. So they're landowners. But things changed during the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom officially started within the Third Dynasty. The sage Imhotep, and Imhotep is Joseph, as I made it very clear through the many messages before this. The sage Imhotep saved Egypt from a 7-year famine. Now this might all sound familiar to you if you know your Bible. But the ancient writings make no mention of a previous 7-year windfall. The combination of these two 7-year periods, when combined, produced an extremely profound change in the history of the planet. In only 14 years, the world of ancient technology drastically changed. Even today, major technological changes are hard to implement in 14 years. Those ancient changes all affected each other. New methods of architecture, new currency, new math, and accounting. New government, new governmental management for large systems, revolutionary medical advances, and we already covered that when we looked at Pathotep, another name for Joseph also. And education and religious transformations, all transpiring during a dramatic change in weather patterns. The 7 years of plenty have been overlooked as a major event in the whole of Egypt's long history. In fact, without these plenteous years, the world's technology would have been retarded by centuries. At no other time in Earth history had years of prosperity made such a dramatic difference. The difference between this 7 years of plenty and other years of plenty was its plannability. By knowing ahead of time that the land would bring forth great abundance, enabled planners to produce and to proceed with massive projects. In other words, there were 7 years of plenty. And they knew there was going to be 7 years of plenty. They had knowledge that the plenty years would come, and it did come. So they took advantage of that. And they went to work. The long-range weather forecasters today well understand that if one could forecast weather 7 years in advance, it would create vast amounts of wealth for those taking advantage of it. This 7 plenty and 7-year dearth in the Bible story enabled Egypt's royalty to not only buy up the land, but eventually even buy the people. Amazingly, this event helps us identify the era in Egypt's history when this biblical story transpired. We must look for an era in Egypt's history when she acquired unbelievable wealth and influence. Egypt's middle kingdom, the era many historians place Joseph's lifetime, had neither wealth or influence, but Egypt's old and new kingdoms were known as Egypt's golden years. The wealth of Egypt's new kingdom would acquire through military conquest, plundering, slavery, and tribute. This does not match the biblical criteria. But during the Old Kingdom, everything matches. Now, if those of you who have not listened to all the previous teachings that lead up to this point, we covered the timelines and why the timelines is about 1,000 years off, and the reasons why. That's why it's important to go back and listen to those teachings. If you quite didn't grasp it all, I encourage you to do it anyway, even if you listened to the teachings when I first taught on them. Now, where was I? The wealth of Egypt's new kingdom was acquired through military conquest, plundering, slavery, and tribute. This has not matched the biblical criteria. But during the Old Kingdom, everything matches, because we solved that 1,000-year problem. Even the power and wealth of the new kingdom was not sufficient to build the pyramids and other massive civil projects of the Old Kingdom. Indeed, there was a drastic change in engineering ability from one project to another. In the small pyramid of Imhotep in Dynasty 5, archaeologists say, what were these engineers thinking about? They were making everything incorrectly. It was during those third and fourth dynasties that Egypt experienced extraordinary advance in medicine and art. Art not to be duplicated until the 18th dynasty, and medicine not ever again duplicated. For 7 years, Joseph/Imhotep, the king's vizier, stored grain, which he said would be needed during a 7-year famine, soon to come. And then when the famine consumed Egypt, Joseph sold the grain he had stored and gave the proceeds to the king. You'll find that in the Genesis record. In fact, why don't we just go to it? Genesis 47. Genesis 47 reads, let's start with verse 13, during the 7 years of famine. And there was no bread in all the land. I'm in Genesis 47, verse 13. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore. So that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. So just not Egypt, but all through that area, today which we call Israel, Gaza, up through Lebanon, and so forth. And Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt. You have some money? I'm gathering it up. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt, in the land of and in the land of Canaan. So it's just not the land of Egypt. Joseph's accumulating money, this wealth that's piling up, a massive amount of wealth. But also it's coming from the land of Canaan. For the corn which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when money failed in the land of Egypt, in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth. That's the biblical verses that supports this. Obviously, the Great Pyramids can never have been built until these necessary resources. And we know now how these resources were obtained. It was just not money, by the way, because in verse 16 it says, and Joseph said, give me your cattle, and I'll give you for your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle if money fail. Obviously, the Great Pyramids could never have been built until these necessary resources started rolling in. But civil projects of this magnitude not only command enormous funding, they require feeding and housing for great concentrations of workers as well. How was it done? Well, if you continue in the same chapter and you read through the chapter, you get to verse 20, for instance. Let's just read it. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field. They were no longer landowners, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. Now, go down to verse 25. And they said, Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of the Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. Now, Joseph didn't do this with a lot of resistance. People were starving. People would have died. They were more than willing to cooperate and be part of Joseph's plans so they can live. Now, if you read into historical records, there's some evidence, and I kind of lean towards the evidence that eventually these people years later were able to buy their land back. But they had to give up something. And that something was servitude. Servitude. Because of the extraordinary length of famine, the Egyptians became desperate and sold their land to Pharaoh, which we read in the verses, to exchange for food. The crown, now having the means, purchased not just the land, but the people as well. In short order, the native population was reduced to serfdom. And as the Genesis story states, quote, except the land of the priests, and all the people and land became the property of the king, end of quote. Here are the perfect conditions required for the start of the Pyramid Age and the launching of Old Kingdom splendor. Conventional Egyptologists have no such evidence to support their explanations of what caused the Pyramid Age. Yet the Bible story tells exactly what financed the pyramids. How did the workforce come about? The Bible explains that too. And in fact, if you go to Genesis 21, it says, Genesis 47, verse 21, and as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other. Sounds like Joseph has one heck of a workforce. And not only that, he's moving them all around. And why wouldn't they want to move? Think about it. They're no longer landowners. The land that they had, even the cattle and so forth, was now all belonged to Pharaoh. They had to totally rely on Joseph and his if you really think about it, God-inspired plan to survive. Remember, the years of plenty that precede the famine, Joseph stockpiled. He prepared. He knew it was coming. I'm sure there's a lot of people that didn't believe in it, but when it hit, they took notice in the first year, second year. They were in trouble. So they really didn't have a choice. So they became willingly workers. Wherever Joseph needed them, they moved themselves and their families to accomplish what was necessary according to Joseph's plan and what he wanted to accomplish. Archaeological evidence has already been found which proves a massive influx, archaeological evidence that is, of native Egyptians moving into urban areas during the beginning of the Old Kingdom. In all of Egypt's history, this is the only era which perfectly matches the biblical requirements. After a detailed study of the marvels of the Third Dynasty, Peter Tompkins, he wrote a very interesting book on the Great Pyramid. He states, but even though it is now granted that the Egyptians were now not living in the dreams, but even though it is now granted that the Egyptians were not living in dreams when they idolized the genius of Imhotep, Egyptologists have failed to investigate what were the scientific achievements of Imhotep other than he was the first one to have designed a pyramid, the step pyramid of Saqqara. This pyramid is just one element in an enormous group of buildings, and is not only so extensive but also so elaborate nothing of the sort was produced again in the long history of Egypt. It became a complex which eventually would distribute the grain, which people not only from Egypt but all over the then world who were suffering the famine needed. And we'll look at it more closely, but not today. In spite of this, not one Egyptologist have tried to investigate this monument and other constructions directed by Imhotep in terms of what the Egyptians said were his talents. Scholars are willing to grant that a man with the name of Imhotep walked in the land of Egypt, but they are not yet willing to grant that Egypt could have produced a mind like his. End of quote. It is the firm conclusion of this writer that Tompkins was correct. Egypt could not, nor did they, produce a mind like Imhotep's. His father was not Egyptian, but rather a Semite. Obviously, Joseph/Imhotep provided King Zoser with the revolution in technology necessary for pyramid building. But what could have prompted him to do so? Although it is now generally accepted that Zoser's step pyramid was an add-on feature of the mastaba, there is convincing evidence that the first stage of Zoser's step pyramid was not a mastaba. Rather, from the beginning, it was intended as a step pyramid. I.E.S. Edwards suspected this to be the case when he wrote, "But was it really a mastaba? If so, the squareness of its plan would be difficult to understand." Noting, however, seems to rule out the possibility that the structure represent a mound which, in simple form but not in the step form, was nearly square, whereas the mastaba was oblong. Does it seem peculiar that Imhotep/Joseph designed the first step pyramid, which many Egyptians interpret as symbolic staircase to heaven? It is the fact the Egyptian word R, just like the letter R, meaning to ascend, when written hieroglyphics is drawn as a double staircase. It is also worthy to note that in the Hebrew language, there is no distinction made between the ladder and staircase. That Hebrew word can be translated either way. Realizing this, serious investigators might do well to wonder why the Hebrew Joseph would design a stairway or ladder to heaven. Could be he heard some stories from his father. In his experience, one evening, as he was resisting, I believe, the pre-incarnated Lord Jesus Christ himself. Did a Hebrew invent the pyramid? I suspect that Joseph designed the step pyramid on the inspiration of his father's dream of the heavenly staircase. the angelic ascent to God. Now, for those of you not familiar with the story, you could find it in Genesis 28. See if I can find it quickly. Yeah, starting in verse 10, Joseph starts having a dream at Bethel. And in verse 12, in Genesis 28, it reads, and he dreamed, not Joseph, I mean Jacob, and he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. We should expect Jacob to tell the dream to his favorite son before Joseph was sold into slavery and went to Egypt. The dream must have made a lasting impression on that lad. If our connection between the step pyramid and Jacob's dream is true, we should see a change or added dimension to Egyptian theology borrowed from the Hebrews. This is precisely the case. It was during this era when the Egyptians began constructing Ibis bull altars of sacrifice. That period also saw Egyptian theology break from ancestor worship and develop concepts of an afterlife. I propose that the pyramid design is a product of Hebrew inspiration and that both the concepts of Ka and of the afterlife were the results of Joseph's influence. Egyptologists know that King Zoser's step pyramid was Egypt's very first pyramid. They also know this Ephesus is a direct architectural expression of a stairway to heaven, which in latter times was incorporated into Egyptian theology as the ascent to the sun god Ra. Now, of course, if this is true, through the course of time, Egyptians went into the occult and started worshiping false gods and false idols and created many different gods. And its original intention was twisted concerning its purpose. So why not Hebrew pyramids? The question naturally arises. If the Hebrews designed the first pyramids, why did the Hebrews not build them in their own homeland? Good question. Back in Canaan. There are several obvious reasons. The Hebrews did not construct pyramids in Israel. In the early years, the Hebrews did not have the centralized government, finances, or resources for such projects. Neither would the people submit freely to slavery. But there is a probable explanation, and it comes from Josephus. In Antiquities, Book 1, chapter 2, verse 3, it reads, they, the sons of Seth, also were the inventors of that particular sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order, and that their inventions might not be lost. They made two pillars. This is according to Josephus. One of brick, the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them, both that in case the pillar of brick should be destroyed by the flood, the pillar of stone might remain. Now this remains in the land of Syriad to this day. As the footnotes of Josephus say, old Flavius was evidently confused and blended three stories into one. The pre-flood story of the Sethites, the Tower of Babel story, and the Great Pyramid in the land of Syriad, which is Egypt. But his point is crystal clear. In the Pyramid Memorial, they inscribed their discoveries, that their inventions might not be lost. I therefore submit that the main reason Israel supported no pyramid was because the purpose of the pyramid had been fulfilled in Egypt. After the latter construction of the Great Pyramid, which incorporated known sciences, there was no further need to erect others. Although the Egyptian people continued to build pyramids through the next several dynasties, it is obvious that their understanding for their purpose was dim. Henceforth, pyramids were built for burial of the dead, with some connection to a spiritual afterlife. Now, there are some archaeologists that believe that Joseph and Imhotep were the same. If you look at the structure, the Zoser complex or the Saqqara complex, you'll find some unique things about it. That whole complex had, and I'll show you next time, grain pits. Besides the complexity of the inner part of the Saqqara pyramid, the step pyramid, and its unique features that also transported grain from one location to another. Now, their evidence, these archaeologists, comes with the existence of a large storage bins where grain was likely stored. These pits are found immediately upon entering the walls of King Zoser's magnificent pyramid complex at Saqqara. The design of these pits is impressive. There are 11 of them, with only one containing a very elaborate stairway, extending all the way to the bottom. All the pits are connected to each other by a subterranean tunnel. The pits were filled and the tops were sealed with wooden timbers and stone. And all of the grain could be accessed from one entrance. And there is one entrance into the pits from outside the wall enclosure of the complex. Last of all, grain was found in the floor of these pits. Though these proposed grain silos have the capacity to feed more than the local population, there would need to be many more such sites to feed foreigners for several years. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but these pits are unique. Nothing like it has ever been found. The subterranean tunnel connecting these pits is ideally engineered to gather grain from the bottom. This is exactly what is needed to extract the oldest grain first. Had these pits been intended as a grain libations for the afterlife, the subterranean tunnels would have not been needed. This proposed grain silos alone would not prove that Joseph lived during the Third Dynasty, but it adds weight to our proposed model, which eventually becomes overwhelming. Now, I plan to show you some pictures of this next time and go into other details concerning it. But I want to leave it there for now. A lot was happening in Egypt during Joseph's early years, being second command to Pharaoh, King Zoser, and I believe another king. But I'm not going to go into that just yet. But the thing is, no one's been able to explain away why these huge grain pits are found in the complex at Saqqara. It's a massive complex. With massive walls, with money exchanging cubicles, and so forth. What was the purpose for it? If grain was stored there, obviously it was for the distribution of grain and buying and selling purposes from foreigners who were coming from far and wide that were suffering from the famine. There needed to be a marketplace. This probably was the marketplace, and there were smaller marketplaces throughout the rest of Egypt that Joseph set up. Now, far as the population of Egypt, they sold their lands for food. Their animal stock. They wanted to survive. They wanted to keep on living. They didn't look at Joseph's plan for their lives as slavery, but an opportunity to keep on existing and accomplish something in Egypt that's really never been done up to that point. Now, there must have been a reason for that. I eventually believe practice makes perfect. When we get to the Great Pyramid, for instance, you'll see a lot of inscriptions. You'll see a lot of architecture that points to God's plan for humanity through the millenniums, all the way to the end. Pyramidologists and people that study the Great Pyramid and other pyramids have come to some faulty conclusions and dating that cast a black eye into the study, especially the Great Pyramid. Because, once again, they put these dates out there, and especially the latter days, the dates come and go, and we're still here. It's like these lunatics, spiritual lunatics that say that the Lord's coming back this date. Be ready. And people go out and sell their stuff and get ready for Jesus to come. The time comes. Jesus didn't come, and they're still here. That's happened also in the study of the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid. And I'm not going to fall into that trap, because I believe there's still key information that's not been available to us to decipher, especially the last timeline walk through that pyramid when you reach the end of the line with the last chamber, the king chamber, that's been so unfortunately badly interpreted, and that's where the false dating comes in. But I'm not going to get into that trap. I have my own opinions, but I still think there's some key evidence that needs to be revealed to see through that dark glass clearly. But that's another subject for another time. I'm going to get to the Great Pyramid. I know a lot of you think that Enoch built it, because nobody, or angels built it, or UFOs and aliens built it, or whatever your theory is. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Enoch either. And it wasn't angels that built it. Could have been Joseph? Possibly. And no matter who built it, and this is what pyramidologists like to skip when they're studying the Great Pyramid, and I've mentioned this before, the top third is not as good a quality as the bottom. Why? What happened? And how could something so massively be built by people in that time? How did they get the skill? How were they able to move such tonnage of stone without heavy equipment? Well, we'll see. We'll see one of the possibilities. You don't have to go super spiritual and come up with Christian science fiction theories. Especially one of the possibilities I will lay out to you, how it could be done, that gives credence and credibility in the study of this Great Pyramid that we'll briefly take a look at. It's a study that would take a year to go through. I'm not going to spend that much time on it. Probably one program, that's it. But it's fascinating. It needs to be looked at. We need to see the possibilities out there of how it could have been constructed. And who better, if he was the one, for Joseph. And then he had help from someone else that was also inspired by God. We'll see. Now, I think I've thrown enough at you. I just want to lay down the groundwork leading up to taking a looking at these pyramids. We'll look a little deeper into the not the Great Pyramid, the pyramid at Saqqara and the complex. Show you some pictures next time, and then move forward into pyramid chronology and so forth. Now, are you interested? If you are, I want to hear from you as we take a look at this in a realistic way that doesn't make us look like some lunatics out there. But concern individuals and how God's word is rightly interpreted and rightly divided. That's my quest. Joseph was Imhotep. Joseph was Pathotep. Joseph, no accident, 23 chapters of 50 chapters dedicated in the book of Genesis to Joseph's life. And I don't think the reason why was so we could know about his dreams. God had a bigger plan, a bigger purpose. And Joseph happened to be the man that God chose to carry out his will to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Now, I plan to continue with this next Wednesday. Hopefully you're there and you're interested, because this will get much more interesting in the weeks to come when we look into other areas, including getting all the way to Moses, because I'm going to include that, I decided, in this study. It started with Abraham, and it's going to go all the way to Moses. Are you interested? If you are, let me know. I'm waiting for your call or email, and do it now.